Morning, very early morning here up in the cold north. I'm Steve Brown, anthropologist, author, and awesome dad, and welcome to Libertarian Heretic. This session called Whatever Happened to Liberalism? A friend of mine who grew up as a self-identified liberal asked me, please, pretty please do this. Whatever happened to liberalism? First of all, what is liberalism? Well, of course, liberalism, as you might expect, comes from the Latin liber, meaning free. It is related, for example, to the 7 liberal arts. The liberal arts were considered the education necessary to live the life of a free man and originated in an age when not everyone was free. It's interesting to note that the first of the 7 liberal arts, the first 3 of them are called the trivium, root word of trivial, are grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic or logic. Then you moved on. Once you had mastered these and you went to college, which happened at 14 way back then you moved on to arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So what's interesting is the first 3 are about thinking clearly and expressing yourself persuasively. Rhetoric flourishes in times when there are free parliaments and languishes in times of tyranny and autarky and despotism. Liberalism, I found this definition in Wikipedia. Liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. Liberals espouse a wide array of views depending on their understanding of these principles, but they generally support free markets, free trade, limited government, individual rights, including civil rights and human rights, capitalism, democracy, secularism, gender equality, racial equality, internationalism, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. The first liberal is sometimes thought to have been John Locke, who is credited with founding liberalism as a distinct tradition based on the social contract, and also who defined the Western notion of what property is, as in property rights. As an aside, an iconoclastic professor at Central Oklahoma University I knew once delighted in pointing out that conservative icon Barry Goldwater was a 19th century liberal in all essential points. And I have pointed out to prominent conservative editors and such that in Europe, what they call a liberal is still closer to what many here call a limited government conservative. At any rate, the late Milton Friedman, also considered a right-wing icon by some, one of the prominent free market economists, up until as late as 1968 and later, was still insisting that what he was an American liberal. He said, American liberalism is distrustful of power and holds that power to be rendered even a little bit safe must be limited, distributed, and balanced. That it must be limited to strictly defined functions, as in the U.S. Constitution, that it must be distributed, that decision-making powers should be distributed down to the lowest decision-making level in government. You don't ask Congress to put a stop sign on your corner or a crosswalk, for example, and balanced, that the power should be balanced between the different departments of government, which we all learned in civics. They're called executive, legislative, and judicial, that each of them fiercely jealous of their prerogatives, i.e., we do not rely on the goodness of mankind and electing the very best among us. We assume that the worst among us may achieve power and that power corrupts. Now, does this sound like what people think of as liberalism today, particularly things like free markets, free trade, limited government, individual. No, not much. As Eric Hoffer pointed out, every movement decays. A movement first starts out with idealism, and then it becomes profitable, and then it becomes, so he said unkindly, a racket. Now, what happened to American liberalism? I propose to answer this question here. Two of the important factors, I believe, are bandwagon and mission creep. So liberalism in many ways was a victim of its own success. Bandwagon. People, when liberalism became popular, when the name became associated with what I would still call the noblest political movement in the history of humankind, people who were not in any way, shape, or form liberal jumped on the bandwagon. If you recall the old communist rationalization, we're just liberals in a hurry. Bandwagon, people jump onto it. Mission creep. The low-hanging fruit has been picked, I say, but everywhere, working men have the right to organize. You can't work men like you did in the 1920s and 30s. Equality, women first got the vote, and then now, as in with civil rights for minorities, it's silly to call women a minority, but since they're 51% of the population, but with people who were formerly discriminated against and such, discrimination is no longer just not allowed, it's illegal. The charge of discrimination can ruin you as a business. Fighting the charge. Furthermore, it's vulgar. Remember, I think Oscar Wilde, who said, "War will not cease merely because it's wrong, it will only cease when it's vulgar." We don't have a draft anymore. Religion has been pretty much kicked out of the public place, and to the point where things formerly considered innocuous, even by atheists and agnostics. Okay, so you got the Ten Commandments. So, all right, if you're not religious, a couple, 3, 4 of them are irrelevant. But thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. That kind of. Hey, what's the problem? Who cares where it comes from? Look at the frieze around the Supreme Court. You'll find both Moses and Muhammad up there. As I said, the low-hanging fruit was picked. So what do you do when you have a movement full of what I call cause junkies, what Milton Friedman called the true believers? Well, when they get what they want, when they get what they want, do they say, "Okay, good job, let's go home"? There is a story that William Wilberforce, who succeeded in outlawing the slave trade in Great Britain, after Parliament did this, supposedly turned to one of his associates and jocularly said, "Well, what shall we abolish next?" And the fellow just went right over his head, and he said, "The lottery, I think." Hey, cause junkies, they don't go home. They look for a new cause. Now, the fact is, with liberalism, again, when the low-hanging fruit was picked, the problems that remained proved intractable. The fact that racial discrimination, or discrimination on the basis of sex, later the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, which was the big thing in my adult lifetime, when all of these things became actually illegal, it didn't solve a lot of problems. Minorities did not, because they were no longer being legally discriminated against, did not immediately jump into the upper middle class and such. As I say, some of the problems proved intractable, And rather than dig into the underlying causes and say, okay, for example, as a friend of mine likes to say, the skills and attitudes that help you survive in poverty do not help you get out of it. In fact, very often they keep you mired in it. For example, the macho display behavior necessary to survive in an honor culture. That shit don't fly in an office, believe me. The intractable problems looked like they would require long, painstaking, patient, and most importantly, very unglamorous work. So, okay, well, I don't want to believe that. So instead, I'm going to believe that there is pervasive unconscious bias, that there's, unconscious racism. No, I'm not a racist. Yes, you are, and that proves it. See, because you deny it. Yeah, Darvo, that's called. Look it up. D-A-R-V-O. And things like, okay, the experiments in rewriting our language to do things like eliminate gender-based titles. Like, remember the Ms. Remember that? Now it's quite common. It's quite innocuous. It's even quite useful there. So maybe a woman doesn't want to give away her marital status. But it didn't end what they thought of as sexism there, because and I could point out to a couple of examples, like in Polish, there is no difference between the honorific for a married woman and an unmarried woman in common usage. Pani. Pani so-and-so. Pani Kowalska. The Japanese doesn't have gender-based discrimination on that. Everybody is san. A woman is so-and-so san. Might I point out that neither Japanese nor Poles are models of enlightened male feminism. So what do? Is they double down. They double down on this stuff. And in doubling down on trying to eliminate the causes, their strategy of eliminating the causes of persistent poverty, persistent prejudice, etc., 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 they become extremely illiberal about how they go about it. In their rage and frustration, they say, all right, goddammit, if you're not going to be, enlightened, feminist, unprejudiced, whatever like that, we're going to ram it down your throats. Of course, the most controversial case lately being bake the cake. Bake the cake, and baking the cake specifically against Christian bakers who did not want to. In one case, it wasn't that he did not want to bake a cake for a gay wedding. It's that he refused to decorate it with a phallus there, because it offended his sensibilities. So, well, we're going to put you out of business. The rationale for that is that if you open a business, you are basically a public utility. What happened to free markets, freedom of association, property rights? This is why I say, and I have said for years, to the consternation and distress of a number of people, that liberalism without an underlying philosophy of liberty, liberalism under stress, becomes fascism. Think that one over, and before the rocks start flying through the window, I think I shall sign off. Thank you very much. I'm Steve Brown, the Libertarian Heretic. Good day.